responsibility and good individual responsibility. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rita. You were rather compressed your speech well within the time. Once again, I thank you for it. In fact, this was a real eye-opening for all of us, where we could see that in the first crisis, we could see corporate debts write-off, which plunged the world economy into a crisis. And now in the sovereign debt, we could see that country debt write-offs have plunged the world into another set of crisis. Of course, there is a Tamil saying, loosely translated, it means, when the scorpion bites the palmyra tree, the swelling comes in the coconut tree. So I think the similar analogy will be there in each of the country. And this is what has exactly happened. And the insular economies of the past, as compared to the insular economies of the past, now the world economy is fully integrated. And we could see from the presentation that there has been what will be the major impact led by India and Sri Lanka, followed by Maldives and Pakistan, as has been pointed out by the keynote speaker. And it is very important that the tightening the belt both at the micro level, where both the chartered accountant, the entire professional accountants profession, chartered accountants and cost and management accountants can play a major role. Thank you, Rita, for giving a wonderful presentation within a very rather right timeline. Next, we have another expert who is a well-known expert both in this part of the world, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, former Director of Economic Affairs of the Commonwealth Secretariat. Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy was an official in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and he has occupied various very key positions in the Commonwealth Secretariat up to 2008, and he has been closely associated with the Sri Lankan government in spearheading the economic, as an economic advisor to the government. And I am sure that his speech on fiscal sustainability in relation to the Commonwealth countries where all of us belong, and also with particular reference to Sri Lanka, will give fresh insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank SAFA and CMA for inviting me this morning to be with you. It's a great privilege to be here. We've had a wonderful expose of what's happening out in the world from Rita. She's covered an enormous amount of ground in a very concise and clear way. I'm going to drill down on one aspect of what she touched upon, and that is the area of fiscal sustainability. I'm going to divide my presentation up into two. The first part will be at the global level to look at the causes of the problem of the twin problems of deficits and debt, particularly in the US and Europe, and then also to touch upon this debate that is raging between growth and austerity as to which way one should go to seek solutions, and address the particular issues confronting the US and European economies in terms of restoring fiscal sustainability. That's the first part. In the second part, I hope to focus on fiscal sustainability as it applies to Sri Lanka. And here, if you take a 30-year perspective and look at the Sri Lankan economy in its post-liberalization era, I think one can conclude that the budget has been the main source of instability in the system. And I'd like to try to bring out the implications of that and to see where we are at the moment and to see, make an assessment of the situation locally. So the presentation will be in two parts. Let me start with the global section first, and in terms of the causes of the problem. And there in Rita's presentation, we saw that there were three sets of causes. One dealing with the sovereign in terms of the sovereign, the deficit of the budget of the government and the buildup of sovereign debt. Then you had problems in the banking sector, and then you had problems related to competitiveness and low growth. And if you look at the countries that are experiencing fiscal sustainability issues, you see that there is no one route to fiscal unsustainability. There are these three different ways where countries have got to where they are today. The US, Greece, and Italy are countries where the sovereign performance got the countries to where they are today in terms of large fiscal deficits. Essentially, the country living beyond its means, public expenditure exceeding revenue, to the point where there is a buildup of debt, and then the financing of that debt becomes an issue, at least the financing of that debt at sustainable costs becomes an issue. So that's that one set of countries. US, Greece, Italy fall into that category. Then you have Ireland, where actually the fiscal performance of the sovereign was always sound. However, the main banks in Ireland lent in a very cavalier fashion to the real estate sector. And then when the housing bubble burst, the banking sector got into serious trouble. And the government was forced to take onto its own balance sheet the problems that the banks had on their balance sheets because of their unsustainable exposure to the real estate sector, which collapsed. And that was how Ireland got into trouble. Ireland managed its budget pretty well, but the banks got into trouble. It couldn't allow the banks to collapse for systemic reasons. It had to take on the debts of the banks. Spain is a similar story, but there it wasn't the main banks. It was the regional banks and savings institutions. And again, the exposure was mainly to the real estate sector, the collapse of the real estate sector, and the government having to take on the balance sheet exposure of the regional banks and the savings institutions. Now, the competitiveness channel that, or the causality, competitiveness-related causality of fiscal unsustainability that Rita spoke about applies to Portugal amongst the countries in Europe which are having that difficulty. Portugal has had very low growth for a sustained period of time because the economy lost competitiveness. The authorities were not able to undertake the tough measures that were needed to increase productivity and make the economy competitive. With low economic activity, revenue shrank, the budget deficit got bigger, and as unemployment got higher, the automatic stabilizers in the economy, like the unemployment payments, went up, pushing up expenditure. So you had expenditure going up, revenue coming down, and Portugal getting into trouble. So you have these different ways in which countries' fiscal outcomes can become unsustainable. Now, what are the lessons? I think there are three lessons perhaps to draw from the experience of the US and the European countries that have got into difficulty on the fiscal front. The first is that fiscal unsustainability does not necessarily only come from the performance of the sovereign. That if you get into trouble in the banking sector for systemic reasons, then those problems can migrate onto the government balance sheet. So you need to, the financial sector stability is important in terms of fiscal stability as well. The second lesson that has emerged is the power of the bond markets. And this is particularly important for Sri Lanka, as we've just graduated from low-income to low-middle-income country status. And over the last few years, there has been increasing exposure to the international capital markets. There's now over $3 billion invested in government treasury bills and treasury bonds. Once you have that exposure, as soon as there is any kind of uncertainty, the bond markets can be extremely brutal and harsh. So this mix of rating agencies and bond markets, people talk about the tyranny of rating agencies and bond markets is something that one needs to factor into account in terms of economic policy making once a country becomes exposed to international capital markets. Because once you get to that situation, the cost of policy mistakes are much, much higher. Because the international capital markets, the bond markets, are much more harsh than the IMF has ever been. And so a country like Sri Lanka, which is now graduated to low middle income country status, in a different situation, and the premium attached to sound economic management, particularly sound fiscal management, is now much higher because the costs of mistakes are also much higher. The third lesson is that it's better to act early. I think a number of these countries had difficulty in summoning up the political will to take action on a timely manner. And then you kind of keep kicking the can down the road, and the bond markets come and bite you suddenly. And then the problem escalates, is elevated to a much higher level. Now, Rita spoke to you about the solutions, the possible solutions to the different types of causality associated with fiscal unsustainability. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'll talk a little bit about this growth and austerity debate. You essentially have two schools of thought. One school of thought, and that you hear from particularly the Germans and the UK government as well, is that the way to get over this deficit and debt problem is to have a sharp shock. You have an austerity package, it's cold turkey, sharp shock, you stabilize the fiscal situation, and then you create the condition for sustained non-inflationary growth in the future. That is one school of thought. Critics of that school of thought say that if you focus solely on austerity, you get into a non-virtuous downward cycle. That austerity slows the economy down, that the revenue, as the economy slows down, revenue comes down. And again, as I said, particularly in Europe, there are automatic stabilizers. When the economy slows down, when unemployment goes up, expenditure on unemployment benefits and other social benefits increases. So in fact, you are chasing a moving target. You are in a non-virtuous downward cycle as the economy has great difficulty in getting out of recession. For instance, this is the 5th year that Greece is in recession, and there is no end in sight. So those who argue against this sharp shock approach say, no, you've got to have growth-oriented measures as well. And here probably the most notable sponsors of the more expansionary approach to adjustment are Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz in the US, who basically say the problem is a lack of private demand. That with the financial crisis, as Rita pointed out, banks are deleveraging. They are reducing their balance sheets. This has an impact on private demand. And it's compounded by the fact that with unemployment levels very high, consumer confidence is down. Another factor in some countries like the US and UK was that households were heavily indebted. So they're also deleveraging. So you have this collapse of private demand. And the way out is for the government to step in and create demand through expansionary policies. So you have this debate. Now, I personally feel it's a little bit of a false dichotomy. It is not an either-or situation. I don't know how many of you saw this, this interview that William Rhodes, the former senior Citibank official, who has been involved in a lot of debt workouts, particularly in Latin America in the 80s and 90s, a very experienced man in this area. And he basically said, look, at this point, we need to learn to both walk and chew gum. simultaneously. And that is it's a good lesson, it's a very good metaphor. One has to have stabilization, yes, but one needs to try to do that within a growth-oriented framework. And again, I think Rita in her presentation had a slide which showed how one can build in growth-oriented policies while one has an overall stabilization framework. Let me now talk a little bit about the US and Europe, and in doing so, I hope that we will, some of this, what I was talking about, this debate about growth and austerity, more light will be shed on that. Now, as far as the US is concerned, it is possible for the US to run a large deficit for a longer period than any other country, and also to sustain a higher level of debt. Why do I say that? One, the US economy is still significantly internalized in the sense that its tradable goods sector is relatively small. It has increased recently with the imports from the Far East, but it is still relatively small, and its exposure to the rest of the world is less than many economies. But the more important factor is that the US dollar is the international reserve currency. And that gives the US much more room to maneuver than anybody else. And that was exemplified very well a little under a year ago when Standard & Poor downgraded the US economy from AAA status. Now, if you remember, there was a tremendous amount of publicity given to this, a lot of hype. What's going to happen? The US has lost its AAA status. Paradoxically, the cost of funds for the US came down. Now, usually when a country is downgraded, the cost of funds goes up. Why did the US cost of funds come down? And that is because when there is uncertainty, the downgrading of the US economy created tremendous uncertainty in the world. But whenever there is uncertainty, there is a flight to safe havens. And the US is still seen as the safe haven par excellence. So you had this rather paradoxical situation of the US economy being downgraded, but more and more money rushing into US treasuries. And the US was able to raise money at a lower cost. And that, I think, that advantage the US has comes from the fact that the US dollar is still the international reserve currency, and also, I think, the innate strength of the US economy. The problem for the US is really, the solution for the US, I think, as laid out by people like Krugman and Stiglitz, is not that difficult. It's a question of having a stimulus in the short term, but embedding it in a very clear framework of medium-term debt and medium-term deficit and debt reduction. Sadly for the US, its politics has become extremely dysfunctional. It is no longer able to have the kind of bipartisan approach to resolve the major national issues that the US has shown over its history. Politics has become so polarized that they're not able to do this deal whereby you can have this fiscal stimulus that they've had, the accommodative monetary policies, but put it into a medium-term framework of deficit and debt reduction. That compact has not been reached. In fact, they set up a super committee in Congress to try to do it. It failed. The polarization in US politics didn't allow it. Now, it's not going to get resolved before the elections. One has to hope that after the election that the US will be able to rediscover its capacity for bipartisan politics and to solve this problem. Because it's not difficult for them to solve it, but the political problem is difficult. And if they do not do so, in January, there are going to be automatic tax increases and expenditure cuts which will squeeze growth out of the US economy. Now, let me turn to Europe. Europe has less options. Doesn't have the world's reserve currency, so it doesn't have the same kind of wriggle room. Yeah, sure. It doesn't have the same kind of wriggle room that the US had. And for Europe, really, the challenge is how they have the fiscal compact. You had two basic design flaws in the European Union. In the Eurozone, rather, when it was created. One, you had monetary union without fiscal harmonization. And two, there wasn't a central bank that could act as a lender of last resort. That's a polite way of saying which could print money for governments. Now, they've tried to resolve the first problem by the fiscal compact that they've reached. And the second problem, they're trying to get around it by creating this firewall with the European Stability Fund and the European, I can't remember the mechanism. There are two mechanisms they've set up, which has raised about 800 billion euros as a firewall. But these are all, in my view, inadequate. Eventually, the fiscal compact will probably need to be loosened because the targets are politically and socially so destructive. It's becoming apparent that they are going to be very difficult to achieve. And with the election of Monsieur Hollande in France, I think there is going to be pressure to relax those fiscal targets. Not to do away with the compact. The compact will be there, but I think some of the targets will be relaxed to create wriggle room for more growth-oriented policies. At the same time, I think the concept of Eurobonds, the mutualization of the debt of Europe has to happen to solve the problem. And that, of course, the Germans find very difficult because what will happen is that the cost of borrowing for Germany will go up while the cost of borrowing for others will come down. Now, should the Germans make that kind of sacrifice? They're already writing checks. One could argue that they have benefited greatly from the Eurozone. If Germany today had the Deutschmark, it would be infinitely stronger than the euro is today. And this massively competitive German export machine, which has been extraordinarily successful in recent years, would not be anything like as successful because it would lose competitiveness because of the strength of the Deutschmark. But because it has the euro, which reflects the combined strength of the Eurozone economies and dilutes the strength of the German economy in the process, it has a highly undervalued currency, which makes Germany highly competitive. And nobody can accuse Germany of currency manipulation. The Chinese are accused of currency manipulation for having the yuan weak, but Germany is not accused or cannot be accused of currency manipulation despite having a far weaker currency than it should have because of it's part of a currency union. So it benefits greatly from the Eurozone, and I hope the German people and the German politicians are able to come to the point where Eurobonds come into being. So I think a more flexible fiscal compact and Eurobonds, mutualization of debt in the Eurozone and the issuing of Eurobonds are the way forward. And for the US, as I said, they have to come to an agreement, a bipartisan agreement on how they're going to have a medium-term program of debt and deficit reduction. Let me quickly come to Sri Lanka. As I said, could I have 5 minutes? Is that too much?
Yeah, it'll be impinging on the next speakers.
Okay, okay. Then I'll speak on Sri Lanka in the discussion. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Indrajit. I feel guilty that I could not give you more time. But because the macro aspects what you have covered, starting with the key role played by the banks as the custodians and dispensers of money, and the tyranny of rating agencies and capital markets, as you rightly called it. But the last point what you made on the growth-oriented policies and the proactive role of government intervention in the economic expansion, and the interlinking of politics and economy, how it affects the economic environment of not only the country but the region. He is Director of Strategic Development, Getz Pharma Limited. More than that, he has been very closely associated with the entire all the CMA bodies and the CA bodies of the region in his erudite presentation in many forums. The only complaint he has against any chairman in his session is we give less time. But this time I promise him that I will give him the full 25 minutes. Over to Mr. Hanif Razari.
Dear friends, I need 5 minutes of yours, because every day when you pick up any newspaper, my country unfortunately becomes the headlines of the world. Terrorism. You people have experience for 30 years, and we have an experience of 10 years. Please pray for us. We should not stretch that thing to 30 years, because 66% of my country's population is waiting for good days to come. Dear friends, I promise you, the way we are going right now, and with the same resolution, I want to welcome Sangakkara and Jayawardena in Pakistan once again with T20, ODI and Test match, even though we are at a very bad shape yesterday. Dear friend, this is the showcase of my presentation. I will skip few of this because through Aman Ki Asha, during the breakfast time, I borrowed 5 minutes from my Indian president of ICWAI, and I told him, you have to give it to me, otherwise I will burn out. This is Pakistan. 180 billion population, and 66% of the people see these beautiful faces, not less than Aishwarya Rai. They are waiting for the beautiful future, but they are right now passing through a darkness that how future will unfold for them. We all are talking about sustainability. My dear, charity begins from home, and sustainability begins from the country, and then you talk about the corporate, and then you talk about the individuals. Whatever we deliberate over there, it will not be sustainable if you are passing through a very bad time. You have seen the other side of the points, Taliban and all of this. Rita will witness it because she has seen all these things. Have you seen? This is the beauty of Pakistan. 3 hours from Karachi. Just see what an unusual place to visit for. Have you seen this beautiful river? This is sustainability. This shows you how the green worlds will work. And I assure you that this is purely a virgin beauty that no human hands have touched and make any changes in this, like Switzerland. Dear friends, we are not less than Switzerland. We are not less than Nepal. You just have to see it and see over here. If I can climb that rocks and give a voice to Raman, he will say how Aman Ki Asha will go. This is nicely we are connected. See the beauty of my country. Sir, very unusual shape to see it. This is waiting for all of you people to come over here. And this area would like to impress you with all sustainability for the future to come. These 2 people in the world only have climbed this place. I wish Raman and me should have been. But unfortunately, this could not happen. This is not the Great Wall of China. This is the wall of Ranipur, 30 kilometers away from Karachi, and the beauty will start. See this beautiful hills waiting for you people to just implement and talk over here about the sustainability model. Have you ever seen the beauty like this? This is the largest glacier in the world, waiting for we all to discuss about there and have a conference over there with a confidence. And I'm proud, Rita told me that she has gone from Peshawar to Quetta. I don't know how many hands have touched her, and she has touched this beauty from the origin. Oh, Nepal take the claim of the one side. We take the claim on the other side because we are jointly together. They earn 1.3 billion as a revenue every year, and see with all this beauty, my country doesn't contribute 20 million rupees. Dear friends, there was a time when we used to say that the world around us is changing and changing fast. Let me tell you, that is not true anymore. World around us is already changed. When we are talking about cloud computing, then except having a hand touch, you will have all the touch over here. And when you are talking about how sky has turned into cyber, I can just tell you that click over here, the heartbeat goes over there. And working for a pharmaceutical company, I can say that the sustainability always goes from the economy of the country, and GDP is the cardiogram which will say that how healthy your economy is prospering. Before talking about sustainability, dear friends, why we should not talk about the business model? We all are talking about the country. Every country from the core of its heart has a business model at traits. Jack Trout says in 21 Immutable Laws of Marketing, he says the country is known from the traits they perform. If I take Argentina, best for leather. If I say Japan, electronics. If I say Charter, our beautiful friend from Europe come and say Charter is our design. If I say Express, American Express has got ownership of that word. If I say Jumbo, DHL will say we have the ownership of that word. So this country is a country, this world is a world of a global competition. But this global scenario is surrounded by the challenges. Goldman and Sons, Moody,